We are live and we are seeing our participants come in, and we are here for this special episode of Drinking with Historians. I have to say, like, you guys have lovely Zoom backdrops, which seem curated. So, I mean, I feel like I have to say this every time. Like, I'm just in a kind of a crappy spare room, so that's why I have the virtual background. Varsha's always looks so much more professional and nice than mine. So I'm glad our guests are. Look wonderful as well. So
Yeah. I just want to thank everyone who's joining us for this, mainly because I'm super excited because I know almost next to nothing about American religion. And all I know about the history of American religion is from my survey classes and my orals prep. So I want to welcome Dr. Demez as well as Sarah Posner, who have both written books about evangelicalism. So I don't know if people know, but Kristen's book is Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Very awesome title. And Sarah Posner's book is Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump, which is something, as someone who is not at all Christian, has wondered since 2015. I've like genuinely been confused about this. I understand that everything is political and people can abandon all of their deeply held beliefs for their political views, but it still confuses me. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. And first question off the bat, what are you drinking, Sarah?
I am drinking a Boulevardier.
So what's in a Boulevardier?
It's
for those of us uneducated.
bourbon, sweet vermouth, I think, and Grand Classico. It's often made with Campari, but Grand Classico is the more authentic precursor to the bright red Campari. So that's why my drink isn't as red as it might be.
Nice.
Wonderful.
Kristen, do you also have a cocktail?
Well, I've got a drink. I'm here representing the non-coastal, non-elites. And so I've just got some cheap rosé, actually.
Yeah.
And it's been my drink of the pandemic. And so this is all truth and transparency. This is what I do. This is how I write.
Nice.
That's fantastic. So, Varsha, I'm going to guess you have bourbon. Is that a good guess?
Yes, I have bourbon, but
Okay.
unlike you're supposed to, I have put ice in it because Berkeley is going through a heat wave right now. It is very, very hot, but I do have a new bourbon. Okay, so it's Four Roses, and I had it once a while ago at a bar, but I don't remember how it tasted at all. And I was in the store, and I was like, whatever, might as well buy it, and it's amazing. I think it might become my daily bourbon besides Woodford. It's that good.
My drink was made with Four Roses.
It's so good. It's so good. Yeah.
There are certain bourbons. I think Four Roses is one of them that sits well. I mean, it drinks well by itself, but also mixes really well. Like not all bourbons are kind of like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. What cocktail are you having, Matt?
So I have, as I posted on Twitter, I have something called a Martinez, which is really wonderful and delicious, in honor of the Bay Area, because supposedly it originated in Martinez, California, right out there in the East Bay. But also it's a gin drink, and I feel like we've been very heavy on the bourbon, and we want gin drinkers to be represented as well. I mean, not in the kind of 17th, 18th century English workhouse gin drinkers, but like kind of more fancy drinkers. But it's really lovely, and it's a little bit sweet, but it's also incredibly smooth. And I do have some backup bourbon as well, which you'll probably see me dip into a little bit later. So I hope everybody has their drink because we have so much to talk about, and we only have an hour. So, but first I want to ask our guests, Kristen and Sarah. So my understanding is you both have books that just came out, and they happen to be kind of on white evangelicals and Trump. So, Sarah, maybe we'll just start with you. Could you tell us what's kind of the basic premise of the book? Now, don't tell us so much that we shouldn't buy it, right? But give us a little bit.
So I have to first say that I'm really honored to be here because I'm not actually a historian. I'm a journalist. But there is some history in my book. So my book is about how white evangelicals came to support Donald Trump and particularly how they came to do so at the same time that the alt-right was embracing Donald Trump, and how that coalition is deeply rooted in the history of the New Right in the United States. When I'm talking about the New Right that arose in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And how together they're not only supporting Trump himself, but this political change where you have this right-wing nationalist, Christian nationalist, white nationalist movement that is antithetical to a liberal democracy. So together they oppose civil rights, human rights, all of the levers of a liberal democracy, like a free press and an independent judiciary and an accountable government. And so that's the through line of the book, that these two movements came together to support Trump, but also as part of this larger global movement towards the far right and more nationalism, and in this case, Christian nationalism, along with the white nationalism.
Now, I'm hearing you say, and I'm a simple medievalist, so I don't understand these things about American politics, but I'm hearing you say that religion and politics somehow intersect in American culture today. That's kind of crazy. Like, Kristen, you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? In your book, which just came out?
Right. Yeah, Jesus and John Wayne. So I'm a historian of gender and religion. And this is essentially a book about white evangelical masculinity and militarism. And it kind of traces that thread through the last 75 years of American history. And when I started digging around into this topic, I had no idea that it was going to culminate in Donald Trump as our president. And so it really is, by using this lens and looking at the history of American evangelicalism through the lens of gender, very quickly it becomes apparent that, narratives about white evangelicals kind of betraying their faith to support Trump, or kind of setting their faith aside and being co-opted, that's just not sustainable. That if you look at the faith that they've practiced, the beliefs they've embraced, there are all kinds of very close affinities between the kind of militant patriarchy that they've embraced in their homes and churches, and the kind of masculine strongman kind of recklessness that Trump himself embodies. And it's all it comes together in this kind of culture wars Christianity, and in this political moment that we find ourselves in today.
Yeah. So
just
to
ahead,
back up here. Sorry, just to back up here.
I have so many questions.
Yeah, I know. I have so many questions. But just to back up here, all I know, and maybe some of the viewers know about evangelicalism, is that in the 17th century, and then later in the 18th century, and then in the 19th century, in the United States, and before that in the colonies, the evangelical movement sort of began as a pushback against Calvinism. And it's like Calvinism, for people who don't know, is basically all you need to know is that it's predestination. The people who get to go to heaven, they're already decided, they're on some big list. People who get to go to hell, they're already on some big list. But what evangelicals sort of preached in the colonial United States, as well as after, is that you are in charge of your own salvation. So I guess my question for Sarah and Kristen is, when does that change? Or is that still a big part of evangelicalism today?
Well, we could talk all night about Calvinism and evangelicalism, but we won't.
Yeah, I teach at Calvin University, so there's that. Part of the thing, when I was writing this book, very quickly, we get backed into this corner of who are evangelicals, right? How do we define this term? And there are huge fights going on right now in scholarly circles about this definition. And I've taken part in more than my share of them. And I actually push back against people who are trying to explain contemporary American evangelicalism in terms of this long, long history. What I find is that scholars who do that are often trying to, intentionally or not, kind of locate the heart and soul of evangelicalism in some sort of a kind of doctrinal rubric, that you can kind of check boxes, and in some kind of like global faith or global historical tradition. And I'm really focused on evangelicalism as a cultural and historical movement. And so I really pick up in the mid-century with a little bit of a look back of where are we coming from, but the evangelicalism that really coalesces in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s is in many ways a kind of a new thing. It's where you have these kind of traditional gender roles in opposition to what's going on in the rest of culture, linked with Christian nationalism. And in the context of the Cold War, this takes on a very kind of militant stance. And that's where I think we really need to pick things up. You can find precursors, but that earlier evangelicalism is in many ways a precursor to much of progressive Christianity in America today. And so, you need to kind of complicate that and not just because we use the same word, evangelical, assume that we're describing the same things in different historical moments, because there's a lot of change that happens over time.
Yeah. Do you guys know when it changes? I know that's a really boring historical question, but I find it fascinating. Like, is it in the late 19th century, or is it is it during Nixon's time? Like, when does it change, do you think?
I would put it at different points. There were different inflection points for different changes in the movement, or different ideas that were coming into the movement, and particularly different media for communicating their ideas that developed. And all of these things resulted in different evolutions of evangelicalism. So you had the rise of what is now Christian Zionism, with the idea that Israel plays this prophetic role in world history, and Christians have a role to play in that, and God has a hand in that. You had the Azusa Street awakening, which gave rise to greater spread of Pentecostalism. And then you had, as Kristen says, the Cold War played a huge role in shaping how evangelicals, in her case, she talks about it in terms of gender and patriarchy, but it also very much shaped the way that they saw their role in American politics to combat what they believed were the incursions of communists into American life. Yeah. Later, that became focused on Muslims, they believed were some kind of fifth column in American politics. Then you had, school desegregation, and then you also kind of around the same time had the Supreme Court cases striking down mandatory school prayer and Bible reading. All of these changes were taking place like in the 50s and 60s and roiling evangelicals. And then in the 60s and 70s, especially, the rise of Christian television. Back in the 20s and 30s, it was radio, and people like Amy Semple McPherson made use of that. And then you had television with Christian Broadcasting Network, Trinity Broadcasting Network. All of these things resulted in changes within evangelicalism, not just in the way that they conveyed their ideas, but also how the ideas were shaped and intersected with politics, which is the area that I look at. And Kristen probably has more to say about, other ways in which it intersected with culture. So there's lots of different movements and changes that are all taking place over the course of different decades.
Yeah.
Did I pass?
Can I follow up?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
Well, I was curious. I mean, again, I have a million questions. I guess the question right now, right, is how aware of the subjects that you guys are talking about in your respective books, how aware are they of this history? Because one of the things that's always fascinated me, and maybe it's just as a medievalist who basically kind of a church historian in some ways, is the awareness of my own subjects, the awareness they have for their past, and that tradition is incredibly important to them. But there seems to be in certain, and not certainly not all, but certain kind of white evangelical communities, kind of a flattening of time, right? Is that tradition doesn't matter. It's kind of an omnipresent now. And I'm going to follow that up with one brief anecdote as an example. Is that a while ago I went to the Holy Land Experience in Orlando, Florida, which is an amazing experience.
And it's owned by the Broadcasting Network.
Yes, it's owned by TBN. Yeah, which was absolutely amazing because you can go there and they sell like those giant turkey legs. You get it like at like Disney World or something like that, and you can also watch a live reenactment of the crucifixion of Jesus, like while you're eating a turkey leg. It's like going to a mall, but being like in first century, Judea or something like that. So, but anyway, but again, like it just reinforced this idea that like all of Christian history is happening right then, and like the moment that these evangelicals are participating in is directly linked to biblical history, and so they're reenacting it or living it in some way. So I guess this is a long way of saying, like, how aware are they of this history, right? Yeah. So
that's a great point. And in fact, so mine is a cultural history. It's really looking at lived experience. It's looking at the popular literature, the popular radio, and how, again, this was not like a faith that got co-opted. These are earnest believers who have embraced this ideology in all sorts of different ways at a very popular level. So when I talk to evangelicals themselves, and I think I've gotten more than 150 letters from evangelicals since this book has come out. And yes, and almost to a one, they give some version of, this is the story of my life. And, but I never understood how all the pieces fit together. So one guy said, I bumped into so many of these trees, but I never saw the forest. And so they know this history because they've lived it, but they never saw what was really behind it and how all these pieces connected and how that brought us to where we are now.
So Sarah, is it similar for you in the kind of the populations that you're kind of talking about?
So your discussion of the Holy Land experience reminded me of a visit that I made to a pop-up version of the Bible Museum before the Bible Museum was built in Washington, D.C. So the Greens had kind of like a traveling version, a much smaller traveling version of it. It's much more, the current real big version is much more sophisticated than what I saw. And it was in a strip mall in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And they had an entire room of King James Bibles, and they had a lot of stuff related to the Reformation. And they even had, they had like what's it called when you press a button and the figure stands up and starts talking, an animatronic statue figure.
Animatronic, yeah.
Animatronic, yeah.
So like you could press the button and see John Tyndale, talk about how he was persecuted, or Anne Boleyn, what she said right before she was beheaded. And it was just very strange and dissonant to me to be in a strip mall, like a really sad, depressing strip mall in Colorado Springs, and like seeing this, and like, it's like, but the whole theme of it was that Christians and Protestants in particular have been persecuted for their faith throughout the centuries. And this is what we evangelical Christians are experiencing now in 21st century America. Yeah. And so I think that it was just very striking to me how the history was sort of used to tell you a story about yourself and why you should not like the government, or why you should, not vote for Democrats or whatever. I mean, they weren't that explicit about it, but it was an interesting and very kitschy use of history.
Yeah. So I want to key in, if it's okay, on something you just mentioned about the word persecution specifically, and I think that really kind of underlays a lot of both of your discussions about the perception that these communities have about their relationship, both to the government, but to kind of the culture at large. Like, where do you see that coming from? So, Krista, do you want to start maybe on this one?
Yeah, this is something that I began to tease out as I wrote the book, because it's a book on evangelical militancy, and kind of the standard narrative is that evangelicals became militant because they were very afraid, right? But then fill in the blanks for what really provoked that fear. It was communism, it was secular humanism, it was feminism, it was Islam, terrorism, so fill in the blanks. But they had no choice but to respond with militancy. And then I started to take a closer look at their own communities, at their own churches, and I saw that this was a pattern that was repeated in their own institutions, where a strong leader would actually provoke fear in the hearts of his followers in order to step in and justify his own protection and consolidate his own power. So Jerry Falwell Sr. did that, Mark Driscoll did that. And that's exactly what I saw in the book. I follow the stories of these ex-Muslim terrorists who became all the rage on the evangelical speaking circuit after 9/11, and promoted by all the big guys, Paige Patterson and James Dobson. And they're all frauds. They're total frauds. And these organizations that were promoting them, and some still do, knew that they were frauds. And so all of a sudden I had to turn this whole equation around. You know, are evangelicals embracing militancy because they are genuinely afraid? On the individual level, that is true for some. But who's stoking this fear? And are these legitimate fears? And that's where you really have to look to leaders who are stoking fears to consolidate their own power.
Interesting. Yeah. So I guess my next question is, why is John Wayne in your title? That I genuinely, like, I haven't actually seen a John Wayne movie. I know I'm a bad American.
You're so young.
Don't worry, I only became an American in 2017. Before that, as Donald Trump would say, I was a greedy immigrant. So I just genuinely want to know. I don't think I've seen a lot of Westerns. So I genuinely want to know, why is John Wayne so important to the evangelical story?
Yeah, so I started reading just dozens and dozens of books on evangelical masculinity. And this was back in the early 2000s when I first started paying attention. And what really struck me was that, you know, for all their talk about being Bible-believing Christians, when it came to understanding masculinity, most of their evidence was not coming from the Bible. It was coming from Hollywood movies. So their favorites were Mel Gibson's William Wallace of Braveheart. Yes, there's so much we could unpack there, but I won't. And then also John Wayne. John Wayne just kept popping up, and it makes a lot of sense if you know anything about John Wayne. Right, the films he starred in, he's this cowboy hero, and then he's this war hero, first in World War II flicks, and then in Vietnam flicks. And so he's like the icon of rugged American masculinity. He's the white man who's going to bring order through violence. He is an American hero. And this is the kind of nostalgic masculinity that evangelicals also are embracing in the 60s and in the 70s against the backdrop of Vietnam. And it makes sense that he continues to be kind of, well, as Eric Metaxas says, the icon of American manhood. And so I thought that was just really interesting. And that culture has shaped, you know, despite all their claims that their Bible, you know, that the authority of the Bible, that culture has really shaped their conceptions of masculinity, so much that then they've reshaped their own theology in accordance. Like they've recast Jesus of the Bible into this warrior Christ with like tattoos on his legs and like riding off into the sunset. And so it's really quite striking. And then they use popular culture of their own to disperse that throughout American evangelicalism and increasingly global evangelicalism.
So I'm so interested that you brought up Eric Metaxas. He told me in an interview in 2016 that he did not think that Trump was the proto-fascist that everyone was making him out to be.
I read that. Yes,
Well,
Eric Metaxas is a lot of things, I will add.
Yes, I have some thoughts on Eric's Metaxas, mostly from Twitter, but I will not share them right now, but maybe after this drink. But anyway, Sarah, I wanted to kind of throw this to you for a minute, is how does this relate, as what Kristen was talking about, this kind of cult of masculinity, this popular culture kind of almost kind of fetishization, right? Like, how does that work with Trump specifically, right? The subtitle of your book is like worshiping at the altar of Donald Trump, right? So there seems to be this connection. Like, so how does it play out there, especially given what you just said about like Metaxas, at least initially, a little bit skeptical, you know, about Trump, and now full-throated. I won't finish that sentence, but go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to add to that really quick, especially because the main thing about Donald Trump that people who aren't evangelical don't understand about why evangelicals support Trump is the fact that he has not only had multiple marriages, but has also been accused multiple times of sexual harassment and assault. So I just like, that just does not wrap in my brain. Like, why is it that so many evangelicals have thrown away the normal Republicans, you know, who are diehard evangelicals and in favor of Trump? I just want to add that to the question, because like that is what I don't understand.
So Trump, white evangelicals like Trump because he's a strong man. Okay, that's the reason why they like him. They don't like him in spite of that because they had a handshake about nominating judges that would overturn Roe versus Wade, right? They genuinely like the fact that he disparages liberals and political correctness. And he's showing that he's not going to pussyfoot around about that stuff. He's just going to come right out and say it and be strong and vital about it. He's not going to worry about his place in history. He's not going to worry about bipartisanship. He's just going to say it and do it. And so compared to Ronald Reagan, compared to George W. Bush, compared to George H.W. Bush, he just goes out and does it. And we can get into like Reagan being a very similar figure in terms of the masculinity and so forth. But I'm just sort of focusing on, you know, things that he'll say and do and why they like him. So when the Access Hollywood tape came out, everybody thought, okay, surely this is the end of him, right? Because how could he be on tape talking about how he likes to grab women by the pussy, and if you're a star, they let you do it? Well, it's like, if you're a star, they let you do it. That's exactly like, that is like the prosperity gospel. That's what you see on TBN every day, right? So, so after that tape came out, there were a number of evangelical pastors who were still really close to Trump, who, you know, had a prayer call with him or whatever, you know, and to them, you know, they prayed about it, and, you know, he's going to get through it. You know, God sent him to save America from the liberals, and so we're all good. And he does not have to be a Christian. He does not have to be able to cite the Bible or even hold it right side up outside of St. John's Church, right? So, because God has his hand on Donald Trump, and sometimes God chooses an unlikely leader to save a nation, And that's what—
Just saying, that's really worrying about God. I'm just saying.
You have some questions for God. He's not here, so we'll just have to answer them for you.
We'll have to put them in the Q&A, and then we'll get to them later.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to do, because we have an amazing amount of questions, they're really wonderful, and I want to get to make sure we get to those. But I do want to ask, is that one of the qualifiers we always kind of put, or I've been trying to put, like, as I've been promoting this, and I think this is really important, is white. Right, is the question of race, right? Because you know, as numerous polls have shown repeatedly, like, we're not talking about kind of evangelicals as a block that cuts across kind of racial lines. Like, we're not talking about Latinx, we're not talking about Black, we're talking about white evangelicals. So why is that adjective, that qualifier, really important? And I want to hear from both of you, please.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of gets at, again, what is evangelicalism? And if it is just, you know, this little rubric that you can check the boxes, then sure, you've got Hispanic evangelicals, you have, you know, Black evangelicals, you have, you know, evangelicals in Africa, you know, the world over. If you see it as a historical and cultural movement, then you have to start asking, I don't know, are they in the same churches? I really look at evangelicalism as a consumer culture. And Sarah brought this up too, that we have to think of the media and just consumption patterns. And there we see fairly distinct communities, fairly distinct traditions. And if you wanted to use a kind of rubric of beliefs, as soon as you get beneath the surface of those beliefs, what do you mean by authority of the scriptures? What kind of activism? What does conversionism mean to you? Then what we're really talking about a rather distinctive cultural, historical, and political movements. And I think we need to treat it as such. So yes, my book is about white evangelicalism, and it's about white evangelicalism as a distinctively white movement. And these ideas of militant masculinity are always gendered. They're white, and without exception. And I think that's very important to acknowledge, and it makes a lot of sense of what we see around us right now in terms of white evangelicals and politics.
Yeah.
And in my book, I get more into the actual political organizing that took place in the 1970s to bring evangelicals into what was then known as the New Right. So to bring them into what became the organization, the Moral Majority. And the thing that animated them was that the IRS was trying to ensure that private schools, including private Christian schools, were abiding by the same desegregation rules that public schools had to abide by. And the Christian school movement viewed that as an attack by the government, you know, again, we're getting back to these themes of the government is against them, they're persecuted, and their religious freedom is under siege. And they viewed that as an infringement of their freedom to run their Christian schools without the government interfering at all. And this is what animated the movement that was led in the 1960s and 70s by the man who became the first executive director of the Moore Majority. And I'm not talking about Jerry Falwell, I'm talking about a man named Robert Billings. And he was at the helm of this movement to bring Christian schools into politics to contest what the IRS was doing.
Interesting.
So I know we said we go to Q&A, but I have one more question. And since I'm the co-host, I get to ask it.
Yeah.
So schools specifically, right? Is that, so down here in Appalachia, I teach at Virginia Tech. We had a Ten Commandments case in a school a few years back. And one of the defenses was specifically referencing Columbine and how that had taken, or one of the reasons that we're having so many school shootings, this person suggested, was because God had been taken out of the schools. So kind of what role do public schools specifically, and evangelical engagement with kind of public schooling, does that play in your narrative, or at all?
Well, they don't like public schools because prayer has been taken out of them, as you say, and God was taken out of them. And then the government has tried to interfere in the running of Christian schools. Public schools are also where your kids get indoctrinated with Sharia law and Marxism and communism. Did you know?
If only.
That's me.
I'm just saying, like, if I had that amount of power, I would be able to convince my students to actually do the readings.
I know.
Because I'm just saying.
Yeah.
No, that's true. And in the movement, or in the history that I looked at too, homeschooling is a really important kind of strand of this history. And at first it started off as really quite marginal within the larger evangelical movement, and just over time, over the decades, with the help of people like James Dobson, it moves much more into the center, into the mainstream, and it's the kind of preferable mode of schooling. So Christian schools are great, and you got to fight for them. Public schools are bad. Home schools are the best, because then parents have absolute authority over their children and over what their children learn. And that's absolutely key. I mean, all for decades, white evangelicals have been extremely concerned about authority and maintaining parental authority, maintaining religious authority. And part of this is their worldview that they believe that they have access to the truth, and that people outside of their faith have access to lies. And so you don't want to empower people who don't have access to the truth, and you certainly don't want to give them power over your own children.
And often they will not call public schools, public K through 12 schools, public schools. They call them government schools. Yeah.
Oh.
Wow.
If only they got enough
Since
funding
the
from
government is bad,
right,
then therefore the government schools are bad.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So I think we should move to Q&A. We have 64 questions at least, and I'm sure there's more that are coming in. We're never going to get to all of them, but we're going to try. We're going to try. So welcome to the second half hour, Drunk with Historians.
Yes.
Varsha, go ahead. Sorry.
I just want to be. I just have a question about entrepreneurship, because somebody asked a question about entrepreneurship and I'm trying to find it. Basically, they wondered, how does entrepreneurship play into the development of evangelicalism, especially in the 20th century, right? So that includes the prosperity gospel, but also just in general, how does evangelicalism connect with specifically an American type of capitalism? Do either of you guys look at that in your books?
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
so Kristen says.
I'll start, and then I'll throw things over to Sarah. Entrepreneurship and celebrity, right, are huge. Yeah. And part of this change, we talked about kind of changes within evangelicalism. In the early 20th century, the evangelical movement really, well, and earlier than that, it doesn't really, it's not housed within denominations, even though, we call certain denominations evangelical. It's really this movement that transcends denominations. And so it's by the early 20th century, branding is really important, and you don't have these kind of traditional denominational authority structures. So the market is really where they can sell their wares, their spiritual wares. And so throughout the 20th century, you just see that evangelicalism is really promoted through individual entrepreneurial activity. The Christian Booksellers Association becomes hugely influential. Even today we have kind of Lifeway Christian Books. We had the era of Christian bookstores before they went out of business or moved online, and so the whole marketing of the faith has been extremely important, and that kind of cuts out a lot of middle authority structures, denominational hierarchies, and it's kind of direct to consumer, and so a ton of money is made. In book sales alone, it's just astounding, radio, television, and you have this direct access to the consumer, and you have consumer choice. And that's absolutely the story of 20th century American evangelicalism, for good and ill.
Yeah, and I wrote another book that was about the prosperity gospel, but I do talk about the prosperity gospel in Unholy because Donald Trump is the prosperity gospel president. Right? Yeah. So if you look at the thing that Steve Bannon just got arrested for, that's like a prosperity gospel style grift, right?
Yeah.
All right. I don't need to explain it more. I think you get it, right?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
You can ask another question because now there are 67 questions.
They just keep coming. So Sarah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the name of that other book that you wrote that people can buy at finer bookstores everywhere?
Profits, and profits is spelled Profits.
There we go. So always be closing. That's right. All right. So we have a lot of questions. Anyway, lots of questions. I did want to take it in a slightly different direction because somebody asked a really interesting question about something that's been in the news quite a bit and has also been related to Trump, specifically evangelical support, which is about QAnon. How does that relate to specifically, the religious communities that are following them? Because there has been shown, right, at least is my understanding, a substantial overlap in kind of believers in Q and Trump's evangelical support. So,
yeah,
I think that Q directly plays into. I think that whoever the Q person was who started that on Reddit or 4chan or whatever it was, was either in evangelical land or completely understood evangelical land, right? Because they get how this idea that the deep state is out to get God's anointed, Donald Trump, and that there's some weird sexual stuff that, of course, the evil Clintons and Democrats and homosexual agenda that they've heard about for decades, is at the heart of that. And Trump, who's God's anointed one, is going to rescue us from that. Right? I mean, so like it just, regardless of whether it was concocted by somebody who is evangelical, it plays into so many conspiracy theories and ideas that animate evangelical land that's why you're seeing that kind of overlap.
Yeah, I think too that, there's just been such a long history of mistrust of the quote unquote mainstream media. Within evangelicalism, and that has really been promoted by people with a profit interest in, drawing evangelicals to their own media sources. And so this has just been perpetuated. And, so now somebody like, in Christianity Today, I think Ed Stetzer is lamenting, why are evangelicals so prone to be, kind of fooled by these conspiracy theories. And it's really because the message that they've been getting for decades from their own leaders is you should not trust outside, sources outside of this circle.
Right.
And so it's
the government especially.
Yeah, the government especially. Yeah. And so it's just deeply entrenched. And this whole us versus them mentality, again, just perpetuates this. So it goes way back, really, these propensities.
Yeah.
And I would say too, like, sorry, just to add on, I'm sorry, Varsha, is that, these, especially the child abuse kind of portions of this, right, is that, I mean, sexual crimes have been a part of every conspiracy theory since, I mean, these are things that the earliest Christians were accused of by the Romans, right? I mean, so there's a commonality there, and it's because it's tapping into kind of this primal idea that we need to protect people, that the most vulnerable are being exploited and stuff like that. So sorry, Varsha, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think this is specifically a question for Sarah. I was just wondering, like, how does the Tea Party play into the moment we see in 2015 and 2016 and to today? Like, does the Tea Party have a role in that? Yeah.
The Tea Party, everybody thinks that the Tea Party was a movement that was about government spending. It was not. It was about Barack Obama being president. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, like,
Thank you.
seriously.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Barack Hussein Obama.
Yes.
Okay. So in 2009, I don't know if you guys remember Glenn Beck, and he hosted this big rally on the National Mall. Okay, and it was supposed to be like a Tea Party
I
rally.
remember that. Yep.
Big
Yep.
Tea Party rallies. And I didn't interview a single person there who had a gripe about government deficits. Everyone I interviewed there either had a sign that had like horns on Obama, or said he was a Marxist, or said he might be the Antichrist, or told me that I was part of some government media, right? So, you know, this is a continuum. The Tea Party is not a separate movement. It was a particular iteration of these same kinds of conspiracies and grievances that has now just manifested itself in a different way in Trumpism.
Yeah. So kind of following up on that, maybe Sarah, for a second, is so why does, and I apologize, I'm going to use kind of broad brush to say this. Why does the media get that so wrong? Like there's still this narrative, and maybe it's just kind of short historical memory about like they remember the Tea Party movement as a primarily kind of economic movement. They remember was it Santini, the CNBC guy, and his rant that supposedly launched this, like, total bullshit, but whatever. So like why is that just an easier thing? And I guess the kind of the underlying question, and since I've had several drinks, I'm just gonna say it, is why do so many journalists get religion so wrong?
That's actually my question as well. Just to add this, why is it so hard for historians in general, historians who are not religious historians or religious historians of religion, why don't they accept religion on its face value? Because I feel like that's my issue as someone who is not a cultural historian, but who understands the importance of religion. The thing I see in a lot of political as well as economic histories is that religion is never taken at face value. People are never taken seriously. So not only journalists, but why do historians in general get religion so wrong? Not
Well,
religion.
I'll answer this question about journalists, and Kristen.
Yeah.
Okay.
How about that? So I think that so much of what political journalists write about, right? So let's talk about political journalists. They write based on, you know, their access to and contact with political actors and spin writers and astroturf operations, right? So you have, you know, they're told a story about what evangelical Christians want. They want, you know, a candidate who, you know, has Christian values or family values or whatever, and they're told that story, and so therefore they believe that story, or they're told the story that the Christian rights, the modern Christian right, started because of Roe v. Wade, which is not true either, right? So, you know, so there's, I think that in terms of political journalists, they are susceptible to being told stories by press secretaries or, you know, insiders who want to, you know, meet them at the coffee shop or the bar and, you know, give them the inside scoop. And so that's how this mythology around how did the Christian right start or how did the Tea Party start gets sort of entrenched without a lot of asking questions about how religion is sort of either operating under the surface or deployed as as a mechanism for activating voters.
Yeah, I would agree that I don't think the problem is not taking religion at face value. Sometimes the problem is just letting religious actors speak for themselves and taking that and not interrogating further, what's actually behind this. And I remember the Tea Party years, watching that very closely and hearing over and over again, this is a secular movement. This is not a religious movement, just because they weren't quoting Bible verses. But when I would see who was following it, they were all religious people. And it just, you could see the affinities. And I think part of the problem, again, is this idea that religion is something you believe, and it's theology, and you go to church and you do it, instead of seeing religion as a cultural identity. And once you see religion as a cultural identity, then suddenly all of these things start to fall into place. And I think that among historians, that has also been an issue. I think there are a couple of things that kind of left historians ill-prepared for this moment. And one of those is simply kind of the rise of, social history and this desire to let people speak for themselves, to let people, to take them on their own terms. And there are very good reasons for doing that, but then there are some limits. And then there's also the fact that within the scholarly study of evangelicalism, it has been, if not dominated, there's been a large presence of white evangelical scholars themselves who are writing these histories of evangelicalism. And so they are writing with this expertise, and the majority of whom are men as well. And that gives them eyes to see certain things. And for many of these, they're intellectuals. And so for them, the heart of evangelicalism is this belief system and, theology, whereas they're not necessarily bumping up against, the patriarchy, because they wouldn't, by virtue of who they are. And race also doesn't really become visible to them because of a certain privilege. And so this doesn't get kind of analyzed in histories of evangelicalism. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now as well.
And I think survey data after the Tea Party movement sort of coalesced showed that a huge segment of it was white evangelicals, and that a huge segment of white evangelicals associated with the Tea Party movement.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, like, as a historian, but actually who's in a religion department here at Virginia Tech, I mean, like, that's really been eye-opening to me, is to think about people who coming from different disciplines, religious studies scholars, the way they think about kind of American politics is very different than certainly, what I was exposed to, is that historians are, and I think generally, and I'll paint with a broad brush, isn't true, of course, to everybody, but, are still kind of embedded in this idea of the myth of the secular modernity, right? Is that politics and religion have kind of separated and are irreconcilable, and they don't touch, which we are learning all the time. That's just not true. So, go ahead.
I just want to say, a couple people have asked this. Is there anything in your books or in your research where you've touched on evangelicals going abroad? And I want to add to this question by answering the fact that, like, the recent white power movement or neo-Nazi movement or whatever have pointed to the fact that a lot of so-called religious people have emphasized their interest in Israel. So I just was wondering if you could explain that, but especially the foreign policy aspect of it, not foreign policy, but like, is there an evangelical movement that goes abroad the United States? And is that totally different from white evangelicals in the US, or is it the same? That's my question.
You're both nodding no, so
I mean,
okay.
I believe that they have it's the Great Commission. They're supposed to go out to all of the world and evangelize the whole world, right? So you were in that question you asked, there were like 3 different questions, right? So that was one of them. Another one is, why are evangelicals so interested in Israel? And another one is, like, what does this have to do with white nationalism? And I do have a chapter in Unholy about what does it have to do with white nationalism, because, evangelicals are beginning to look, it's not just Trump that they like, but they're also looking at the liberal democracy that America used to be and saying, that's not really the shining city on the hill that we want anymore. So who can we look at who has a country that is more like what we think America should be and what we think God ordained America to be? Oh, let's look at, Putin's Russia or Orban's Hungary, right? And so, that's one answer to the question that you asked. And then, the other, I think more familiar narrative is that evangelicals are very interested in Israel as, the location where Jesus is going to come back. And so their interest in, in Israel-Palestine politics, and also like even weirdly the UAE now, right? That this all has to do with Trump being really great with Israel, and he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and and he admitted this week that he did it, and the evangelicals like it more than the Jews do, which of course, like, we all knew that, but the admission was interesting.
He's more than happy to just blurt it out sometimes, isn't he? So
yeah. So is that similar to the millennialism that you see in the 19th century, or is that totally different? Like it's the obsession with Israel,
or like evolution of it? Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I'll say too that the global reach is something that I originally intended to include more of in my book, and so I've been tracking it for years. And then I realized it's another book. And so I dropped some hints, but for decades, these organizations, again, kind of Great Commission, they're not just spreading Christianity, evangelism, they're spreading this particular ideology, which to them is Christianity, around the globe. And so, yes, Putin's Russia is a great example. Brazil is another example, Hungary, Uganda. And so I mentioned some of these just kind of in passing in my conclusion, but in the 2 months since my book has been out, I've been contacted by activists in Kenya, China, scholars in the Netherlands, and I know in Brazil, and like from all around, saying, giving me more details on precisely how, James Dobson, John Piper, John Eldredge have been exported through these global networks in the name of evangelism, and are wreaking havoc in Christian communities in these locations. And one of the repercussions here is the abuse of women. And I trace that in the last chapter of my book. Is all about, so we talked about Trump's Access Hollywood, and they were okay with Trump abusing women because many have condoned or dismissed the abuse of women in their own churches and families. And it's the same pattern that we see. And that's what we see happening globally too, when these very, militant patriarchal teachings combine with patriarchy kind of on the ground. And it's really a toxic combination. So this is very much, a global movement. And you have to look at the interplay, the interactions, but it is being exported and has been for decades.
And also, we were talking about television. It is exported that way too. TBN is all over the world.
Yeah. So, Holy Land Experience, turkey legs, watch Passion of Christ after the pandemic. Anyway, so picking up on this idea, a bunch of people have asked this question. I'm gonna try to combine a few different kind of questions. The question is generally about abortion, and kind of the role that plays in this type of community. But I also want to kind of throw in the question of, and I know this is a little bit outside of your work, but maybe if you're willing to think about it, is the role of the Roman Catholic Church too, specifically like the types of alliances that these white evangelicals have built around abortion, for example, and these political ideas. This has been a big controversy. If there's been some controversy about sojourners. This article about white supremacists and the Catholic Church taken down, put back up, all sorts of stuff like that. But also things like the Church Militant, if people don't know about that, this right-wing organization out of, I believe it's out of Detroit, but also other things like that. But again, like this kind of the crux of this idea of abortion is kind of tying them together and leading to support for political candidates related to judges and the Supreme Court and things like that. So can you both kind of speak a little bit to kind of that, kind of what's going on there? So that was a lot. I apologize, but
well, in bringing evangelicals and fundamentalists into politics, Catholics led the way, right? So I talk about in Unholy, I talk about Paul Weyrich, who was Catholic, but eventually went to an Eastern Rite church because after Vatican II, the Catholic Church was too liberal for him. But he was the architect of the religious right. He was one of the architects of the New Right, and he brought, he was the one who brought Billings and Falwell into the moral majority. And he was very animated by the abortion issue. because he, as a Catholic, as a very right-wing Catholic, it was very important to him to oppose abortion. And he just couldn't get, it wasn't until later that he got the evangelicals to like focus on it, but he couldn't get them to focus on it. And then he was like, okay, we'll bring you in on the Christian schools. And then it was only later, with people like Francis Schaeffer, like going around and evangelizing evangelicals on the abortion issue that they then after the fact became engaged on this. But I would say that now politically, this alliance of right-wing white evangelicals and right-wing white Catholics is, that is what the religious right is. And so when you look at Trump's cabinet, for example, I would put someone like Bill Barr, who's Catholic, in the same political camp, right? Yeah. Or Alito and Thomas and Roberts and Kavanaugh, they're all Catholic and anti-abortion. So it's really like it's an alignment of these two separate, denominations, whatever. we just talked about how denominations don't matter, but it's alignment of like right-wing Catholics and right-wing evangelicals in a way where a right-wing evangelical would have more in common with a right-wing Catholic than a liberal, Presbyterian, right? And so in a way, the fact that they're Protestant and Catholic doesn't really matter as much anymore. Whereas there was a time when Protestants in America were very anti-Catholic. But those lines have been erased because of politics and particularly because of the abortion issue.
And I'll just throw Phyllis Schlafly in there too, right? As another Catholic who kind of paved the way for bringing together, gender, politics, anti-communism, and she was just absolutely crucial in the 1960s and inspired, the next generation of evangelical activists, really, in the way that she brought this all together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Varsha, you're muted.
So sorry. I think I got hiccups because I drank too much water, as well as whiskey. Let's just be honest. Yeah. So I think one of the things that a lot of people have asked about, as well as what I'm interested in, is you talk about how denominations don't really end up mattering, and a lot of things that people have asked is similar to like my question is like, when does evangelicalism become a national movement and how does it become a national movement? Like, this is maybe just a question for Sarah, but also Kristen, but also maybe a question for Sarah is like, is it like business and entrepreneurship that makes like a key factor in changing evangelicalism to like a national movement or even international? Or is it something that is deeply entrenched in like the actual doctrinal things that I'm not really fully aware of? Like, why is it that evangelicalism is something that can represent all of America today, that it couldn't in the 19th century, right?
Yeah. No, that seems to make sense, right? Because, we tend to think, like most people's experience of religion is just the church they literally go to, right? Exactly. And so oftentimes, if they're not, and so I think for a lot of, at least for like kind of mainline Protestant denominations, or even for many Catholics, like they don't think of them necessarily as kind of a national movement. So, but this is clearly not that. So.
Yeah.
And also just considering the fact that like Franklin Graham, I think, I forget which Franklin Graham it was, senior, junior, I'm not sure.
There's only one.
There's only one. Oh. He shows up in The Crown, like in like season 2 or season 3 of The Crown.
Billy Graham, Billy's father.
Billy Graham.
That was Billy. Right,
sorry. Yeah, Billy Graham. Sorry, again, I'm getting my Christians confused. He shows up in The Crown, and like Elizabeth I is like obsessed with this, or Elizabeth II, sorry, is obsessed with this guy. So I guess like that's my question. Is like, how does capitalism and like how does it that like the church you go to is totally separate from like the national church? And I guess that's my question. Yeah.
Wow. You go first, Kristen.
Okay, yeah. So Billy Graham. That's where I was going to go with it. As critical, he is kind of the celebrity around which evangelicals, many fundamentalists, kind of unite. And he, if you see the era that he really starts to gain prominence, it's World War II. And he combines, and this is right around the time that the National Association of Evangelicals is forming in 1942. And they feel like they've been marginalized. I mean, it's a common motif in white evangelical history. But, you know, we had the Scopes trial in the 1920s, and they did not disappear, but they just disappeared from view of, you know, liberal elites for a time. And they were working in their own, you know, Bible schools and their own organizations, their own churches, and they were doing just fine. But they wanted to have more national power. They wanted to have more influence. And then World War II comes along, and although many fundamentalists were quite separatist during the First World War, and actually were ambivalent about militarism, by World War II that had changed, and liberals had flip-flopped the other way. And so in the Second World War, this was like the good war, right? The war to save democracy and all these good things. And evangelicals, the majority of whom, especially Billy Graham, were rah, you know, militarism, rah, war. And in that, then that, you know, quickly transitioned to the Cold War by the end of the 40s. And they were just perfectly positioned because, again, communism was anti-God, it was anti-family, it was anti-American, it was all of these things. And they just, you know, had that militancy ready to go. And they believed that they were the faithful remnant. They were really going to, you know, and so they provided a great service to folks like Eisenhower in the White House, who wanted to kind of stoke up this, you know, anti-communist sentiment. And so there's this mutually beneficial relationship, and Billy Graham is right at the heart of that. So that's a lot of history. What happens then by 1960s, of course, is that this kind of consensus era starts to break down, and evangelicals again feel marginalized, and they want to be back at the center and in the halls of power. And they're continually kind of looking back and trying to reclaim that power. So I'd say 1940s, 1950s to 60s is a critical era where we see evangelicals staking a claim on the nation, and then ever since then have wanted to kind of reclaim that power.
And I would say, in terms of, I'll start at a later point in history to say why denominations don't matter anymore, which was a component of the question, right? And that is, and I would say that a huge factor in that was the rise of the prosperity gospel, which really began in the 1950s. Some people could, you know, pin it back to other, you know, new thinking, you know, new age kind of movements, but it really started to take hold in the 1950s and 60s, and then really took off in the 1970s with the advent of religious television, right? And so then it started to permeate the churches in such a way that now you can have a Southern Baptist pastor who sounds more like a prosperity televangelist than other fellow Southern Baptist pastors. And, you know, for the book, I interviewed Robert Jeffress, who's very close to Trump and one of his leading supporters. He's a Southern Baptist pastor. He told me denominations don't matter anymore. He hasn't been to the Southern Baptist Convention's annual meeting in years. He endorsed Paula White's book. You know, Paula White is very close, you know, it's Trump's spiritual advisor, who's a prosperity televangelist. And so, like, none of this matters anymore. He's a lot closer in ideology in terms of, you know, prosperity and victory and Christian nationalism to Paula White than he is to his fellow Southern Baptist Russell Moore, who's somebody else I talk about a lot in the book. So you have this movement of Christian nationalism, which now has transcended denomination to be this, like, much more of a nationalist movement that has this version of Christianity as its core and has collapsed previous denominational lines.
And I will say it has infiltrated the main line as well, right? That's important to realize.
Yeah. Okay, so before Matt wraps up, sorry, I just have to ask, like, the last thing I'll ask is something that historians should never really ask other people, other historians, is if you had to tell us about the future, like, where do you see the future of evangelicalism? Like, is there anything in the past few years that tells you about it? Like, is there a decline? Is there a second rise? Like, what is happening with evangelicalism today? I feel like that's something.
Third Great Awakening.
yeah, like, are we at the third great awakening? I'm sure that in 1801, the first thing a bunch of people wrote in newspapers, like, hey, the second great awakening has started. Like, is there a third great awakening that's happening? Or is this something that you can't tell about at all? Is it totally unpredictable?
This feels like a moment of fracture, right? And historians are usually very cautious about identifying, moments of great change. But I think we can make a case that this feels like it could be one. But it's really, on the one hand, as a historian, I can say that this ideology is so incredibly entrenched. And so I'm a pessimist about, dramatic change. That said, these times do feel unprecedented. And especially if you look at younger evangelicals, if you think that, as I do, that this religious culture has been formative, I think that culture is breaking down for the young generation with social media, where they just have access to so many more ideas. And so they cannot be in the same bubble that, people like me were when we grew up. And so if there's going to be change, I would say, we have the demographic change we're looking at, but then we also have just the cohesiveness of this community among the younger generation. I don't think is going to be as strong. And I think leaders know it. And that's why they're really digging in their heels right now.
I agree that they're digging in their heels for that reason. But I also worry about the politics, because we're in this moment where, because I don't just look at evangelicals in the book, I also look at the alt-right. And we're in this moment where these right-wing nationalist movements are really becoming more entrenched and popular around the world and powerful. And so that worries me to the extent that there's, a connection between that kind of right-wing populist, right-wing nationalism and the American evangelical right. And because we don't know what's coming out of this pandemic and this election that Trump is who knows what he's going to try to meddle with or, pass along disinformation about. And so all of that worries me a lot.
Yep, the authoritarian tendencies are absolutely there.
Yeah. I have to say, just as a church historian, going back to something Sarah said earlier, is about denominations not mattering. As somebody who's studied Christians killing each other about denominations really mattering for freaking millennia, this is weird to me, and it's always been a strange thing. But anyway, we are unfortunately out of time. I have a million more questions. We have almost 80 other questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A. What you'll all have to do is buy Sarah and Kristen's books. Do you have copies of those by any chance?
Right.
There they are.
Yep,
That's perfect. So, and the links are in the chat too, so you can buy them directly. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, Kristen, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for spending your Friday evening or afternoon or whatever time it is from wherever you're joining us from. With us. Next week, we're going to have Sarah Bond, who's an ancient historian who has talked about Roman history and also is a columnist for Hyperallergic and has been on Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. It should be really wonderful. Until then, thank you again for joining us. Go buy Sarah and Kristen's book. Have a great Friday afternoon, and cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers.